Welcome to the Public Works Nerds Podcast with Mark and Mike.
Welcome to the Public Works Nerds Podcast. I'm Mike Spack.
And I'm Mark Ulver.
And today's episode is going to be a little bit different. We don't have a guest today, but we're going to be talking about the Smart Cities Connect conference Mark just got back from. So with that, Mark, set up, what is Smart Cities Connect? What was the conference like for you?
Well, even before that, I just want to talk a little bit about like what is smart cities,
Okay.
and what is the definition of smart cities, because I think different people think different things, and we'll get into this a little bit more as we talk about this conference and what I was trying to get out of it, and like Bolton and Mank, my employer, Bolton and Mank's vision on smart cities and that. But one of the things we're going to be talking about today is artificial intelligence, AI. So if you actually type in to ChatGPT, what is smart cities, it's going to tell you, and I'm going to read this for you. So ChatGPT will tell you that smart cities is a city that uses technology and data to improve the quality of life for its residents, enhance sustainability, and increase efficiency in its operations. This is achieved through the use of various digital technologies such as the Internet of Things, IoT, sensors, data analytics, and artificial intelligence, AI, to collect and analyze data from various sources. The goal of a smart city is to use this data to inform and improve decision-making all across aspects of the city, from transportation to energy management to public safety. That is a really good definition.
That is a good definition.
And it's kind of scary that, it came up with that, but...
Yeah, and with kind of GIS technologies and asset management systems, most of our cities have been smart for quite a while now then.
And that's a really good point. That we've started using this smart city moniker now. And it was interesting. One of the panels that I sat in on, one of the gentlemen, very well-spoken gentleman, like kind of challenged that. Like, I don't like this smart cities name. Because it doesn't necessarily focus the attention in the right place. And to your point, we've been doing smart things for a long time. We've been implementing technology for these purposes, as ChatGPT pointed out, for a long time. I think what's different about this this initiative, I guess, or this new industry is the desire to try to integrate as much of that as possible, to try to, better manage it and to create some frameworks and best practices for particularly managing the data that you're going to get out of all of these different things. We can put all the sensors in the world that are out there in our city and implement them and activate them and start collecting data from them. And we can be literally buried in ones and zeros from that data. But what you do with that data is the important thing. And I think that's where the smart city part comes in, is how we're kind of wrangling that, all of those different applications and all those different technologies, and how we're managing that data. And that's what gets into some of the key words and phrases and topics that came out of the conference that I saw out of the conference. So kind of moving into that, I would say from the very start, from the keynote, which was the mayor of Denver, where this conference was in Denver, which I think is a really great location for this, by the way, because they have, for 5 years, they have had something called the Colorado Smart Cities Alliance, which has been an organization that creates these events and, tries to bring in private industry, these innovators, to come in, meet with public agencies, figure out what their issues are, like what problems do you have and how do we help you solve them. And so it's kind of a little bit of an incubator from that perspective of connecting those two things of, okay, here's all the technologies, here are the actual problems, how can we connect, how can we find some funding, some grants and some things like that. So anyway, Colorado's got a really well-advanced program for that thing. And Denver has taken advantage of that with some things. And so the mayor of Denver gets up there and he's talking about that very thing, about managing their data, about some of the initiatives that they've been using, particularly from the perspective of like air quality monitors and how they're using that data and some things like that. From panels of other agencies, airports, and things like that, it all really came down to, most of the conversation came down to data, how they are managing that data, what some of the mistakes they made by not thinking about that data up front, like how to manage it, where is it going to be stored, who's going to be in charge of it, well, how much of that data is going to be available to the public, how are we using that data, how long is it going to be stored? We have, most of public agencies now have well-defined data practices for how long you have to keep data stored.
I actually don't know. What is that, 7 years?
Well, and it depends on the type of data, and I should know more about this because when I was at Roseville, but there are some of them are just guidelines, and some of them are hard and fast rules about how long you need to keep data. But like for emails, they don't, if it's not something that you have to keep, they want you to get rid of that within like a year. Okay. And I think that's more of a policy than a hard, firm or a guideline versus a hard, firm policy or law on that. But I think it's like from a law perspective, you have to keep most of that public data around for at least 3 years.
Okay.
And so that gets into, this is a little bit of a tangent, but on that data practices side, it's a liability perspective that if you're not disciplined in getting rid of your data and somebody asks for something and you say, well, we don't have that, and then they actually do a search, like they come in with a warrant or something and they actually do a search and they find it, well, then now you're in trouble. Now they're going to go through a much more deeper dive because you have something you said you didn't have.
Or they find out you purged it the day they requested it, coincidentally, which
right.
Probably far-fetched, but having a standard that you're purging on a cycle is the most defensible.
Yeah.
Way to do
so anyway, that's a factor to consider as we're putting in more and more sensors, as we're collecting more and more data, and we're using it. Well, having those guidelines, those rules of how you're collecting it, storing it, analyzing it, what you're making public, how long you keep it, things like that. And one topic related to data, because we don't necessarily think of this as data, is video. And I heard more and more from vendors and practitioners that, they really don't want the video. They don't want to store the video.
They're huge.
Right.
Yeah,
but besides the amount of storage that it takes, it's the requests that people want for that data. Once they know you have the video, then they're going to request it because, there was an accident here. I want to look at the video. Or we think there was a person here. We want to see that video to see if they were there. Or we want to try to track this person, this or that. So there's more and more reasons for not keeping that data. Now that video data can be important. I mean, it's used in real time for detecting vehicles. And we're doing more and more with video in real time, or immediately post-processing it to look for different events or different things out of that video. But in order to do that, we don't need the license plate numbers. We don't need to see faces of people. We're more interested in just people as a number. How many people are going through here? What those people are doing in that intersection versus what that person looked like, or what they were wearing, or this, that, or the other. And so we don't want that data. We don't from a privacy perspective and from the perspective of people wanting to get that information from us later. So there was quite a bit of conversation about that, and certainly something to consider as you're thinking about some of those applications. And so I think that was probably the biggest benefit of the conference, was really framing a lot of those big picture things, more policy type of things, more strategic things as we're contemplating implementing this new technology. How are we actually going to manage this? What are we going to do with this data? and how does it fit in, and from that, big picture thing.
So that's thinking about more the architecture of the system before you end up with just a rat's nest of a system.
Right.
Being thoughtful of how to build it and how to keep the closet clean.
Right. Absolutely.
So what does this conference look like? And maybe I assume a lot of our audience has been to a PWX conference, Public Works Expo, or some of the other big trade shows. How does this Smart Cities compare? I assume there's different folks there, different companies, different vendors, different levels of staff, even what kind of cities are showing up to this conference?
Yeah, and I would say mostly the cities that are represented at these conferences are cities, 100,000 population or more. Clearly, because we were in Denver, there was a really good representation from Colorado cities. But there certainly was a good representation from your Dallas, your Austins, your name a larger city in California, that's not an LA. But some good representation from those cities. And I would say most of those people weren't even necessarily public works directors. They may be sustainability people. They may be GIS professionals. I don't know that I saw a lot of like city engineers or public works directors, planners. Saw quite a few planners there. There were some public works directors there. I was surprised by, that mix of probably more planning level or sustainability level professionals that work for cities than like more engineering staff. Okay. So that was kind of interesting. And then from the the vendor side or the private sector side, there are some well-defined and established players in this market that are trying to get into more of the integration market. And so they were there. There's one firm in particular that always pops in my mind called Ubiquita. And this isn't a sell or a pitch for them, just as an example. And they're a company that, again, is more of an integrator. And their hook is they develop products to fit in. There's on every light, almost every, like 99% of the light standards that are out there in the public space, on top of those light standards is a little NEMA standard plug that you can get power off of from there. And it's, like I said, it's an industry standard, so anybody can. It's like there's the screw in for a light bulb. Anybody can make that interface, and you can put cameras on. You can make an adapter or a device that fits into there that is a camera, that is an air quality monitor, that is a Wi-Fi antenna, that is just a variety of different.
A little weather station, any kind of monitoring device you have fixed power you can tap into. Yep. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so that's their hook is, making connections with whether they're developing it or they're working with third parties that are developing those little things, but then integrating all of that data into a more, a single interface or a common interface to help manage all that stuff. And that, that hub could also be as part of that Wi-Fi or some other radio communication, can then also pick up Internet of Thing devices within the right of way, whether that's a wastebasket or a park bench. I don't know what data a park bench is going to tell you, but there are all sorts of ideas that are popping up about how do we make our traditional right-of-way devices or our traditional public works things smart, and what data can we get out of them that will be useful, and I think that's the key is and there will be a whole slew of new ideas and things like that. It's a question of kind of testing those out and what actually is a useful piece of data, what is a useful application for your typical public works department. And again, just kind of what this framework of this conference is I do think it's much more geared towards larger organizations, larger agencies, that are, a couple 100,000 people or more. And you hear a lot from the really big cities, the million plus metro areas or cities and metro areas. But you also hear things like there was a couple panelists from airports, like the Dallas Fort Worth Airport was there talking about some things that they're doing, because an airport is like a little city.
Right.
Military base. There was somebody there that was talking about some things going on in a military base, because again, a military base is kind of like a little city. From that same concept, you can think about university campuses. They're doing smart city applications. As a matter of fact, I mentioned the kind of a smart waste basket. I've seen that on a couple of college campuses as we've toured around with my daughter looking for colleges. Where I've seen waste baskets that clearly have some intelligence to them. They're doing something, they're telling something, and usually that is, I'm full or I'm not full. So then they know whether they need to empty that basket or not. And so from that perspective, those university campuses are kind of becoming incubators for potential larger applications, in cities.
Yeah, and just to take that benefit forward from the trash can idea of, okay, maybe you need half the staff running around in the golf carts emptying out the trash, to, because of the sensor and routing them around, like where else can we, that parallel idea, take that to our cities, and what is the manual effort our public works departments are doing that we could reduce the person hours doing that by using data. I think that's the promise of what a lot of these companies are talking about.
Yeah.
But the cost benefit has to be there. And a big part of it, did they talk much about just the connectivity? Because if you have to put in full wireless communication nodes into each one of these devices, that's adding hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to that little widget you're plugging into the light pole. But if these devices can ping off of kind of the mothership communication device, then you only need one of those devices for $500 or $1,000. Did they get into that? Just
not that level of detail. But I think you'd be surprised at, and I know you have developed your own, product, and so you're keen to the costs of individual components of things like that and such. But most of these devices are probably working off of either a really low power radio frequency, and maybe similar to like what you might see on your water meter, if it's a radio water meter, or just a simple Wi-Fi connection, because like going back to the example of the universities, most university campuses,
they're blanketed with their Wi-Fi.
Exactly. So if you have devices that can simply just communicate through that established Wi-Fi network, I mean, that's very low cost then. Maybe you have a private channel for those devices to communicate on that's separate from the public channel. And there are ways to do that pretty simply. Yep. Then, you can do that very cost effectively. And that's where, a firm like Ubiquita is trying to, set up that communication network that works, more seamlessly because you've got that infrastructure with all the light poles already. So just build off of that for not only the device, the air quality sensor, but also the communications component of it. So yeah, and whether that's cellular or Wi-Fi depends on the city that they're in for that.
So you're at this conference and you have people talking about things that we've been doing for 20 years in the industry, really, with asset management and GIS. And were there gaps? Like, what came to your mind of like, hey, that's a great idea, but what came into your mind of like, they're missing they're kind of missing half of the picture here. Did anything come to mind?
Yeah, what was really interesting about the conference and the gap that I saw specifically came from starting with what was at the conference was really primarily focused on mobility. I saw a lot of applications there around traffic, about collecting traffic data in real time or post-processing it for, planning purposes and things like that. And we'll get into a couple of specific examples of that in a little bit. To even talking about transit operations and, autonomous vehicles and self-driving shuttles and things like that. And I think that's because that's the visible part of it. That's what people can see and what we have really easy access to. But what I wasn't seeing much conversation about, even being in Denver, which is a high altitude desert, which in Colorado, water conservation and water rights is a huge issue there. Is I didn't see a lot about that, about the things below ground. How are we using this technology to help us with our, monitoring our water infrastructure, talking about sanitary sewer, things like that. I'm not saying it wasn't there, and I didn't go to every session, and that was, I think this is a common concern about a lot of conferences we go to, is, there will be 6 concurrent sessions going on at once, and I want to go to 3 of them.
Right.
But I can only go to one, and sometimes I'll go to part of one and then move over to another one. But so it can be hard as one person trying to cover a lot of that information. But I didn't see any specific examples, at least that were spotlighted, about the things that are happening below ground, with our storm sewer, with our sanitary sewer, with our water distribution. And so I think that's really some opportunities there to expand the concept of smart cities, particularly for the integrators, is looking beyond the mobility perspective of it. I had one conversation outside of the conference at a reception with a really big consulting firm, about, well, what is smart cities to you beyond transportation and mobility? And she kind of just thought about, well, I'm not sure, because that's their focus. This is a big transportation ITS type of consulting firm, and that's their focus, is on the mobility side. So I right now, those conferences, I think, are heavily focused or biased maybe on that mobility side of it. It's good to bounce around and see different things that are going on in different parts of the country. But it'll be interesting to see how this conference evolves and expands a little bit on that scope, and if we can get past more of the mobility things.
Yeah, you brought up, with being in Denver, and you brought up kind of the consortium of
Yep.
cities that are kind of banded together. How did that come about?
Yeah, and actually, one of the podcast guests that I'm working on lining up right now is the director of the Colorado Smart Cities Alliance,
Okay.
Tyler Svitek, who actually had a really big role in this conference. He was on a lot of panels and such. And, I think we will dive into that more when we have him here talking about that, about the role of these organizations. But one very common thread that I saw, again, on the panels and the general sessions and this, that, and the other, was these organizations across the country. And it's like the Colorado Smart City Alliance there. There's a North Texas Innovation Alliance. There's a Virginia Smart Community Test Bed organization. There's another organization in Florida, I'm pretty sure. But these are all organizations that have popped up, that have been a conglomeration of public agencies and private sector companies that are, funding this joint organization to show advancement and readiness for these smart cities applications. And then they're using that to apply for federal funds or other grants in order to, test new technologies and new applications. And so that's kind of the interesting, and I compare that to that movement, I don't know, 40 years ago or 30 some years ago with the ITS organizations that are very similar.
Intelligent Transportation Systems.
Yep. Thank you, Mike.
Yeah.
So like, ITS Minnesota locally, which was an arm of ITS America.
Mm-hmm.
Here in the Twin Cities area, we had, well, in Minnesota in general, we had something called GuideStar, which was something that our DOT actually formed to try to be more competitive for federal grants, targeted at ITS. And again, it was a conglomeration of private sector, mostly Minnesota companies and Minnesota agencies to again, raise their hand up and say, hey, we're ready here. We want to partner with people. We want to try some technologies out. We want to advance this market. And so that same thing is happening at the smart cities level. And I look forward to having that conversation with Tyler about, well, how did this start up? Who came up with this idea, and how has it helped you guys?
Well, and the benefit I see, especially from when Mark and I were beginning our careers, this ITS America and ITS Minnesota, since we started out as traffic engineers, was a really big deal. But what it allowed by having the big national organization to the local organization, most of the practitioners didn't have to live in that world, but there are a couple of people who were kind of the lead guides in that area. And I could see if you have your consortium of, if there was cities in Madison, Wisconsin, kind of around there, they could send one person to the Smart Cities Connect, and that person could come back and report on what they learned and their perspective, and also bring in kind of the local needs. Like Texas versus Minnesota has some pretty different climate environments. We're a little bit more similar to Colorado, but they don't get as cold like we do. So at least covering the different climates for this technology to make sure they're robust. And we have different public works issues around the country. So I could see the value in having kind of 8 spread out around the country, 8, 10, 12 of these consortiums to try to build the public-private partnerships. Because I think what you're pointing out in the gap of everything's about mobility, well, that's what the consultants are focused on. That's what the vendors are focused on, because they don't necessarily know any better.
Right.
That now that we're talking to more and more public works folks through the podcast and our networks, well, a lot of our concerns are about things underground, because that's really the catastrophic stuff of, okay, yes, we don't like car crashes and we don't necessarily like congestion, but the calls with the sewer backups going into somebody's basement or a water main break and not having water, those feel like a lot more acute crisis situations that we sure would love help with as an industry.
Yep. Hey everyone, I just want to take a quick moment to thank our sponsor, Bolton & Mink, who is producing and editing our podcasts.
At Bolton & Mink, we believe all people should live in a safe, sustainable, and beautiful community. We promise every client 2 things. We'll work hard for you, and we'll do a good job. We take a personal interest in the work being done around us. And at the end of the day, we're real people offering real solutions.
So, just kind of zeroing in on a couple of specific items that I saw, and I actually had some conversations with some vendors. Getting back to that whole Ubiquita firm, they actually make streetlights, and they also specialize in making the street lighting system better. But then on top of that, they're getting into what else can we do with it? How can we make use of that hub? How can we expand it beyond we use the street light as as a hub for everything else. But that's another big application is, most cities, if they haven't already, are going through a conversion of their lighting system to LED, and which opens up the opportunity to do dimming. Have a little better control over your lighting system, make it smarter. You should have a system that will tell you when the light is up. You don't have to go look for it. You don't have to wait for somebody to tell you. A good smart lighting system should tell you that. But that involves, an infrastructure, a communications infrastructure then for that streetlight to talk to something.
Yeah,
and the intelligence
you need
to
a
do it.
dashboard.
Yep. But then beyond that, I had a really interesting conversation with a vendor, a LiDAR vendor. So it's a LiDAR product, and LiDAR, I don't know exactly what it stands for, but essentially it's the sensor that emits like a light pulse around, and it's kind of like a radar but with light.
Mm-hmm.
And it gets that bounce back, and it draws a picture of its world around it, and it's sending out millions of those pulses within a minute, and it's drawing that picture continuously in real time. And it used to be a really expensive technology, and most automated vehicles now have a LiDAR sensor on it, and so it's becoming more and more common. And with that, as technology is adopted, it gets cheaper. Yeah. And so, this product is becoming more cost effective to the point where it now makes sense. It actually competes with like video detection from a cost perspective. So you can use it for detection purposes. What's really interesting is because it's emitting its own light, it's drawing its own picture. It's not reliant on ambient light. It does a really nice job with, at least according to the vendor. I just wanted to point out that I don't have any practical experience with the use of this, or I've not done any evaluation of the accuracy of LiDAR. But, theoretically, it is much better at detecting pedestrians and bikes and smaller items, which are much harder to see in all light levels using, purely video. And other technologies have, issues like, some technologies can only detect the object if it's moving, or this, that, and the other. And so, LiDAR theoretically goes beyond some of those other limitations. Now, it has its own limitations. It's still pretty expensive, particularly if you have to put more than one sensor at an intersection. And so then if you're only using one sensor, at some point you have a blind spot.
Yep.
And they're pretty good at installing it so that it's got, maybe like a 300-degree view of the intersection. So, you just put it strategically so you're not missing anything vital behind you. But what was really interesting about it is not so much the detection of the data, because again, it can detect things in real time and work with a signal controller to do that. But it, and it can measure speed, it can track vehicles, it can track pedestrians, so it can tell you where, the pedestrians are moving from point to point, it can tell you where the vehicles are moving from point to point, so you could do turning movement counts on it and things like that. But what was really interesting is what the companies are doing from a post-processing perspective on it. And there are video applications of this as well, where they're doing post-processing, and this gets into the other buzzword of artificial intelligence. And so now they're taking this raw data of LiDAR and video and this, that, and the other, and they're doing this post-processing and applying artificial intelligence to figure out where you have near misses, like almost conflicts.
Okay.
Where two objects are too close to each other in a certain period of time. And, so now you get to a point where, you can have thousands of hours of this data, and no human can process thousands of hours of that data to figure out where the near misses are. But, if you plug it into a machine or computer has the artificial intelligence to figure that out and process all of that data, well, now instead of just doing and you've got experience with this of redefining, how we use turning movement counts, but instead of just doing it over even a day, now you can do it over a month or a week or a month or even a year, and get, much better averages and means of that data than just one day's worth. But more importantly, again, from a planning perspective, instead of just focusing on where we've had crashes and fatalities and things like that, you can now look at the near miss data. Like, we've seen this near miss 100 times in this one spot, this turning movement with this conflict point with this pedestrian. We really should consider turning that in, converting that to no turn on red, or doing something else to eliminate that conflict point. Because at some point, that near miss isn't going to be a near miss, it's going to be an actual collision.
Right.
And so it just really opens up the opportunity to make much better decisions on what's really happening out there, but this data that we couldn't collect before.
Yeah, it all comes down to dollars.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the money of processing the raw data stream into something that is actionable.
Right.
And that's the thing that is great about the LiDAR, as I understand it, is they're being built more and more into vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
So there are millions of these sensors being built now, whereas if there's only thousands of the sensors being built, they're orders and orders of magnitude more expensive. So in some ways, our industry, because it's a lower use case numbers-wise, needs to keep an eye on what is the bigger picture happening in just the popular culture, and then saying, how can we utilize that as that cost is getting driven down, instead of coming at it from the reverse and saying, here's this brand new technology way to solve our problems, but that's going to be so crazy expensive to build that bespoke solution for the public works industry. The costs come down by saying, okay, here's all these Internet of Things out there.
Yep.
How can we tweak them just a little bit and use them? And sure, it might not be perfect and it wouldn't be what we would design from the ground up, but because we're taking it off the shelf, we can afford it.
Yeah.
So I hope that perspective is starting to be built into the smart cities thinking of we're all cost conscious. None of us has the funds we would like in our budgets.
Right.
So we can't just throw money at technology solutions in the hope it's going to fix it. We need real proven solutions that are cost effective.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point. And I think that actually lends into the next point that I want to make is, for me, as the director of Smart Cities Initiatives at Bolton & Mank, like, what is Smart Cities and what do I want to do with this? And to your point of, the vast majority of our clients are smaller cities, that don't have a budget to just try things out.
No.
I mean, if they're going to implement something, it's got to actually solve a problem. It's got to be useful for them, and it's got to make a difference. They have to get something cost effective out of that investment. And so, as I go to these conferences, and I'm going to start going to some other more industry specific conferences, like, a water industry conference, because I want to go walk the exhibition floors of those conferences, and I want to see what new applications, new technologies are there. They're not being targeted or marketed as smart cities right now,
Right.
But I want to go see what those technologies are, and I want to see, okay, let's take that application. You've got this sensor that does this really cool thing. Let's take that. Let's talk about this. How can we help vet that product, that vendor, that application? How can we maybe add some value to it? How can we maybe create a dashboard that integrates that sensor for water with this sensor for sanitary sewer, with this sensor for stormwater, into more of a common dashboard for our clients that's a lot more scalable, that's a lot more approachable to them. And so that's kind of our vision for smart cities is, maybe it's like smarter cities. Like, how do we help our clients implement and use these newer technologies and new applications in a safe way,
Yeah, in a reliable,
Yep.
cost-effective
Yep.
way, because none of us can throw away tons of money.
Right.
I mean, so by you being out there on the forefront and seeing what works, like, if this smart street light system, all of a sudden they can dim the lights and there's a 9-month payback, and it's also better for the environment on top of the money. then you can start rolling that out to communities with 5,000, 10,000 people in them because the payback is just there and it's almost immediate.
Yep.
So, but those the city manager with a community with 10,000 people where they don't even have their own staff city engineer, they're not keeping up on this.
Right.
So this is the value you're able to take what's being done at the 1 million+ population cities and bring it down to the smaller communities where even that increment of saving $100,000 on your streetlight system a year, like, wow, that becomes really impactful funds for a smaller city that has that smaller budget.
Yep. And I need to have more conversations with these larger companies that are marketing the integration of all these devices and everything else like that, and figure out where their sweet spot is and how marketable they are to smaller cities and smaller communities for the very reasons that you just mentioned. That we can't just spend a bunch of money on this, and maybe again we find those gaps and again where we as a company Bolton & Mink can say, hey, rather than having to buy, it's almost like the asset management conversation we have as far as you've got all these asset management software pieces that want to do everything. And you're trying to put into a city and they're trying to, adopt their operations or customize this software piece to fit their operations. Whereas in a lot of cases, it might just be smarter just to build something up from their GIS system. So how applying that same thinking to this smart cities world of instead of bringing in some large, and I'm not saying that there isn't value in the larger integrators because I think there is if you're big enough. But how can we provide that value, that dashboard, that simplicity, but still integrate a bunch of these technologies into one? So that's what we're working on. That's what we're trying to figure out, and that's where I'm working on developing some of those relationships to figure that out and build up that portfolio, so to speak.
Okay. So at the conference, talking ChatGPT, Google's new Bard system, did anyone bring up the Space Top by Sightful announcement?
The Space Top by Sightful.
Yeah. So Sightful is an Israeli company, and I just heard about it, and I think this could be a game changer for all of our lives, but even at the public works level. It's augmented reality, but instead of being like a Google Glass augmented reality for all conditions, it is a pair of glasses with a little keyboard, and it allows you to have like a Star Trek system where it just pops up a monitor and you can make the monitor as big as you want in front of you. So instead of trying to figure out all the different lighting conditions and background conditions, it's taking a little niche of it. Mm-hmm. But all of a sudden, we wouldn't need smartphones, we wouldn't need iPads, we wouldn't need computer monitors, we wouldn't need televisions. And where I think this could really revolutionize public works is every truck has one of these systems and every guy is wearing these glasses. So you get out to the site and you can just pull up, instead of trying to figure out on your smartphone the GIS system, the work order system, you and the guy in the truck with you wear the glasses, you can pop up the same monitor and it can be as big as a sheet of plywood, and you can drill into the maps and the 3D models of what you're supposed to be doing. And I think there's so much more there for our industry and talking and all of our infrastructure. So it would allow us, we have all of these systems, but how do we tap into them? Right. And how do we tap into them while we're out on the street and be able to look at the same things at the same time? So I'm excited when I heard about that. It kind of really got buried in the announcement of the ChatGPT, but I think it could be just as impactful for your and my lives and your and my work lives as the ChatGPT stuff could be.
Yeah, and even maybe expanding on that, I could see where if you have a maintenance worker or even a surveyor or whatever, or an engineer, if they can put on that set of glasses and you have this overlay, Like you talk about augmented reality. So not only do you see the street, but now you see the pipe underneath the street. And where you see the valve, you can see that valve, but like the glasses that you put on it has the valve number on top of it.
Right.
So you can just like virtually you tap on it and it pops up the information about that valve. When was last maintained? What issues we have, how old is it, this, that, and the other. Rather than looking at a map and trying to figure out, okay, which valve am I looking at here? Or which hydrant am I looking at? Am I looking at the correct hydrant? If you can do that overlay in the real world, that I could see being huge. And again, like seeing the pipes underneath the ground,
Right.
Yeah, and you have to be worried about accuracy and some things like just like we are now with our locates. But just think about how much more easily you could interact with that infrastructure than if you could do that.
And then while you're out there working on it, you would just be immersed in the asset management system.
Yep.
So if something wasn't correct,
Right.
you would be correcting it easily. It's just taking the friction out of maintaining these data sets, because nobody wants to be just typing in data.
Right.
And yet that's what many of our staff are getting reduced to.
Yeah, and a lot of our staff, let's be honest, I mean, interfacing with a phone or a tablet or even a computer isn't really as intuitive as the computer companies think they've become. Still not very intuitive.
No.
And particularly depending on what generation you're from or what your background is or what your hobbies are, it can be really challenging to get to the information that you want, when you want it, where you want it. And if we could somehow improve that interface, so it was really as simple as putting on a set of glasses and you're seeing everything. And you can instantly see, oh, this is not in the right place. Let's move this over to here. Or what was the retroreflectivity of this sign? And you could just touch something and it'll tell you. That would be really cool. And that actually gets into the one of the other buzzwords that was at this conference, which was digital twins. And
I haven't heard that before.
Yeah, so that's a whole nother industry, I guess, or segment. And that's where, and to some extent, asset management and GIS can be considered a digital twin. It's basically a digitized version of a real world thing. All right. So I think the easiest example that people can think of from a digital twins perspective is like taking a building. Instead of looking at blueprints or something like that, you actually digitize the whole building, like the floor plans, where the lights are and the doors are and everything like that. And then you look at a computer screen or a virtual reality world and you see a digital twin of that building. And you can go in and like zoom in and turn around and things like that. You can interact with it virtually to better understand what that infrastructure is. What is your asset? And again, GIS is kind of like I think a low grade example of a digital twin. But as we get into more augmented reality and things like that, you can really understand the benefits of that digital twin. And that's, when I'm talking about being able to put the glasses on and seeing that overlay in the real world, that's like overlaying the digital twin on top of the real world and seeing where the differences are, or being able to see underground that you can't. And yes, so there's a whole industry of how are you collecting the digital twin data? What are you doing with that digital twin data? Using the digital twin data with artificial intelligence to do, additional analysis and things like that with it too. So there's a little bit of convergence with those two things. So it's a really exciting time. I still wonder what is this whole smart city umbrella supposed to encompass? And sometimes I think we put too much under the smart city stuff, and sometimes the umbrella is just way too big in our heads. And so sometimes it's kind of hard to kind of focus in on what we're really trying to do. But it's really an exciting area, and thinking of it just from the perspective of everything that you can do within the city's operation to make it better with technology and sensors and AI and digitizing things. Yeah, it's really exciting to think where we're going to be in like 20 years,
Yeah, it's hard to fathom. where
Yep.
we'll be in 20 years. And it's also going to be an interesting challenge to retrain our workforce in public works around all this new technology and how to utilize it. So kind of the user experience, user interface is going to need so much work just to make sure it's simple and frictionless, even more so than other industries. I feel like our industry needs even more attention to that design.
Yep. No, I completely agree. And again, I think that's where Bolton & Mank and other firms and companies like us have that opportunity to, help with that interface and make it as simple as possible. And maybe it, like, and you mentioned this when we were talking at the coffee shop, the red light, green light, yellow light, if it's red, get out there and pay attention to it. If it's yellow, somebody should probably check in on it. If it's green, don't worry, it's all good. And just like having that dashboard for all sorts of different things,
Right. So
just to simplify
it ties back to the smart trash cans. But if you had all of your system overlaid and you could see the red, yellow, green for all of your different systems, well, okay, there's one red, but there's 3 yellows around it. They're different issues. But hey, while you got a couple people out there in the work truck, check on all of the yellow issues while you're out there. And those are the kinds of efficiency gains. And that's really, I think, what the public expects of us is we're supposed to be ahead of this on the maintenance side. They're not that tolerant of water main breaks and sewage backups or bridge collapses or things like that. We have to stay on top of our maintenance. And that's the promise of the smart cities, is helping us be more efficient at that maintenance and catching things before they turn to the red glaring problem.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's been a long time. I don't know how long we went there, but I think that was a great conversation on that. Thank you for
that's
pulling
a wrap.
that out of me, Mike.
It sounds like a fun conference to go to, and so much different than going to a PWX and walking a giant floor with dump trucks and all that kind of stuff. So thanks, Mark. And one last thing before you go. Although we don't charge for the PDH you just received by listening to the podcast, the Public Works Nerds is not free. If you've listened to more than one episode, the cost to you is to tell one colleague about the podcast to help us grow our audience. Thank you.